He's in prison, an adult prison facility outside of Toledo. He's serving more than a life sentence. Means that he'll be at least 70 before he's considered eligible for parole. But his attorney and other people believe that by the time he's spent his entire adult life and most of his life in prison, he really won't be eligible for parole. He was 15 years old. Today he's 21. He just hit his 21st birthday. And his attorneys say that if he had been 3 months older, he probably would have gotten the death penalty. Well, I still speak with him at least once a week on the phone for the prison allotted time. And I spent weeks out there at different parts over the 5 years I spent writing the book. I would spend about 5 or 6 hours a day interviewing him for 2-week spans. That's a difficult question. I really wanted to look into what was going on with these kids who apparently showed no remorse and seemed to show no emotion after committing these horrendous crimes. But what really hooked me on this case was the Johnsons, the victims of this crime, because I really sincerely believe they deserved better. They deserved an answer to the questions they were looking into, why this child killed. At least they deserved a real attempt to look into what happened here. And I was also angry that Children's Services was trying to cover up what really happened and that nobody was looking at this seriously. There was a reason behind the murders, and I think that to look at them in a straightforward manner is the only chance we have of preventing them, and the Johnsons deserved that. Mr. Johnson died before reform was ever really implemented or even sought, and I think that his quest was something I wanted to continue. The Johnsons were an elderly couple in rural Ohio, and they had foster parented dozens and dozens of children over the years, and Johnnie was about 15 when he was placed in their home. They were better to him than anyone had ever been to him. He liked them so much that he wanted them to adopt them. But one evening in late January, he walked into the kitchen where his foster mother was preparing his favorite dinner for him, and without a word, he bludgeoned her to death and then set her on fire. And it was one of the most horrendous and inexplicable crimes that Ohio has ever faced, because nobody knew why he did it, not even Johnnie. In fact, when he was arrested, he told detectives, "I don't know why I did it, why it happened. She was a nice lady. She didn't deserve this to happen." And he was also appalled that he could watch her bleed to death and not feel anything. He knew something was wrong there. This was his 19th foster placement, and he had been through 19 and 5 years. He had also been through a very poor family environment, but he really wanted the Johnsons to adopt him, and he really wanted to stay there, and he did not know what triggered his rage. He knew he woke up with a churning in his stomach and a feeling that he was going to do something bad, but he had no idea that he was going to commit this crime. They lived in Spencer Township, which is just outside of Toledo. It's a very rural area, a very small population, very little crime. And I think that this was also interesting to me because I wanted to show that these crimes are going on throughout the country, not just in urban areas, but in rural areas and in suburbs. And, you know, it crosses all sorts of lines, economic, social, everything. These kinds of crimes are really increasing throughout the country. I had been hearing from social workers and teachers about these kids without a conscience, these ticking time bombs. And I was very dubious about it, so social workers presented me with a number of different cases throughout the country that sort of fit the characteristics that they were talking about. And one of those cases was this case, the Johnnie Jordan case. And then I called out to Ohio. I talked to Mr. Johnson. I was very moved by how he felt about this crime. I can't say that he forgave Johnnie or in what way he forgave him, but there was this lack of vindictiveness he seemed to think that he and his wife and Johnnie had all been wrecked by the same storm. And he really didn't, he really felt very angry or resented that he hadn't been told of Johnnie's past. It was what had happened to Johnnie that he felt most angered by. At the same time, he clearly didn't embrace Johnnie anymore. And when I talked to Johnnie Jordan, I felt that I felt like I had more anger towards him than even Mr. Johnson did. And then when Johnnie walked into that room the first time I interviewed him, and I realized this was a child who couldn't look me in the eye. He was too shy to look me in the eye. And he still ate meals of Little Debbie's and Coca-Cola. And he was too small for his prison jumpsuit. And he kept outgrowing his shoes, but no one could give him new shoes because the prison would only give him one pair of shoes a year. And social services was no longer involved in his case. This was just a child in an adult system. Frankly, because I think my publisher felt that he wasn't a sympathetic-looking person. He wasn't white, upper middle class. He's a kid, and he is more representative of the kids who are filling the prison system today. You know, he's had a rough past. He often has that sort of that tough stance that I think a lot of kids take on in prison, and a lot of kids who grow up as he did on the streets do. It's a tough issue. You know, I don't know that a lot of people want to face this. Certainly in Ohio they didn't, and they still don't. Some people don't want to face this. The director of children's services there recently said, well, why do we want to open old wounds? Why point fingers? Well, the point is to understand what happened. You know, Johnnie Jordan didn't have to murder. He chose to, and that is his responsibility. But there are reasons why children kill and why we can prevent this from happening in the future. I think that's very important. I think there's so many things to learn, both personally and also, you know, within the welfare system about how to prevent these situations. People don't want to look at kids who murder because it seems like a horrendous, awful, inexplicable thing. But what I'm saying is there are reasons. We often see stories of kids who just suddenly erupt, you know, the Columbine shooters, or just kids across the country. And we often hear that there was no reason, there was no trigger. Well, oftentimes those reasons are hidden in juvenile files, which are closed to the public. And I think that those privacy laws are not protecting the children as they were intended to. They're certainly not protecting people like the Johnsons. They're only protecting a system that's failing. I think because it seems like a difficult issue, something that people don't necessarily want to look at. And they don't want to care about what happened to Johnnie Jordan. But I think that Johnnie is more representative of the kids who are in adult prisons now. I think most of them have come from his kind of rough background. He looks like a kid. When he was in prison, he was trying to put on weight to make him look tougher so he wouldn't get picked on as much. But the weight kind of fell into fat. You know, not a fat kid, but certainly just not a muscular man yet. He's a child still. He's been working out a lot since he's been in prison, so now he looks a little tougher. He often sits in sort of a tough inmate pose, you know, with his legs spread, like looking like he's ready to pounce. But he still has a soft look in his eye oftentimes, and he still looks like a child. Yeah. That's a good question. And at first he didn't want to talk to me. At first he wanted to get paid for participating in the book, and I told him that I wouldn't do that. And then he was reluctant. He said, what do I get out of it? And I said, don't you want to help other kids like you so kids don't wind up where you are? He said, why do I care about other kids? I don't care. You're stupid if you care about other people like that. Now that was the tough Johnnie Jordan. That's the outward Johnnie Jordan that you see on the surface. There's another side to Johnnie Jordan, which is much more compassionate and gentle. There's only a part of him that's cut off from his emotions. My husband's a journalist for the Washington Post. He was sent to Pakistan for 3 weeks to cover the war, and it was a difficult time for me. And Johnnie called every night, reminding me to kiss my baby goodnight and to make sure I wasn't too lonely. And Johnnie had nothing to gain from that. The book had already been out. He had already read what I had written, and it's not always a very generous and oftentimes not sympathetic look at who he is. So there are many different sides to Johnnie Jordan, and just as when you look at him, there are just many different features. He often appears rough, but there's often something very young about him. Johnnie Jordan Sr. is in prison serving about 40 years, 40 to 70 years for the abuse he inflicted on his children. And his mother was in prison for 2 years, but she plea bargained her way out of a longer sentence. His mother is often on the streets now. His father is serving prison time. And his father, I have to say, is the ugliest man I've ever met. And I don't mean physically. I just mean sitting down and talking to him. Everything he says is self-serving. He told me that Johnnie committed the murder so that he could spend more time with his father because he loves his father so much, because he wanted to present himself as a good father. And in fact, Johnnie and his father were incarcerated in the same prison at one point by mistake. That's not supposed to happen. And Johnnie said that he would, when he saw his father, he didn't know why, but he'd just feel like throwing up. And Johnnie is a kid who had been through abuse, but either didn't recognize the abuse or didn't want to admit the abuse. Either the abuse was so normal in his family that he didn't recognize it as abuse, or he tried not to remember it. He plays with his memory a lot. He tries to remember things the way he wants them to be. She's in and out of drug. She has some substance abuse problems. She's not a very, stable person. I saw her briefly, but she did not want to talk to me for this book. They had 7 children, and even before Johnnie was born, social services was aware that there were problems in the family. And the parents, I think, were so befuddled, I guess that might be the word, that they actually named one of Johnnie's younger siblings Johnnie, because they had forgotten they had a child by his name. Johnnie is the 3rd, and he's 21, and his oldest sister would be probably about 26 now. They're all split up. They're all in different places. The 2 youngest are with his step-grandmother, who also cared for Johnnie. One of them is in juvenile prison. The eldest is on her own with 2 children of her own. Most of them, except for the eldest, have been in and out of different foster care facilities and different juvenile detention facilities. For the first time, he was in a prison that had a branch for juveniles in particular. And then he was transferred and put in with adult inmates when he should have been with juvenile inmates, because they try and separate them in Ohio, although it doesn't always work. Then he was in a prison with his father, and they didn't recognize the father and son were in the same prison until I requested an interview, and then they had to separate them. So he's just been moved all around. At first he had a very difficult time in prison. He was in solitary confinement an awful lot because, like most kids in adult prisons, they tend to lash out a lot. In fact, once, one of the first times I interviewed him, I was alone in a conference room with him, and before we went into that conference room, I saw a kid who was incarcerated jump up and grab the person who was visiting. And the guard took me aside and he said, "These are the most dangerous criminals you've ever met, these kids, because They don't wait until they're on the street to get somebody back. They just react at the moment to whatever happens. So you have to be very careful in interviewing them. And the day before, one of those kids in that environment had pulled a knife on his former girlfriend and grabbed her, and it was a hostage situation, because most adult criminals recognize, if I do this, I'm going to get more time and I'll just wait till I'm on the street again, or they do it in a more subtle manner. But a lot of these kids are very impulsive and will just react. In prison, in adult prisons, 3/4 of the kids serving time in adult prisons are black. Johnny's African American. The Johnsons were African American. She was almost 70, and she was 62. Her husband was 70. Johnny had been with the Johnsons for 3 months. He loved playing checkers with Mr. Johnson. He loved teasing and joking with Mrs. Johnson. He felt very comfortable there, and they really liked him, but they had noticed some disturbing behavior. They were never told of his past. They were just told that he needed a temporary home for 2 or 3 days, but those 2 or 3 days stretched into 3 months. He had not been enrolled in school by social services because they kept expecting to move him. The day of the murder, Johnny had found out several days before that he was going to be moved from their home, and he was upset about it. The day of the murder, he woke up with a churning in his stomach and this feeling that he was going to do something really bad, and he didn't know what it was. And all day he tried to combat this feeling inside of him. He tried to change what he felt. He thought he'd go out for a walk, but it was too cold to go out for his walk. And he called his counselor several times during that day, paged him. He said, "JR, you better come get me. I'm going to do something bad. I don't know what I'm going to do, but I'm going to do something bad." And JR, who, like a lot of people in his position, was burned out. He's got dozens of kids on his caseload like Johnny. And it's a stressful situation. You know, these kids call at all times of the day and night. And it was taking a toll on him, and he was getting out of town for that weekend. So he said, "Johnny, you can hold on till, wait a few days. I'll be back in a few days." He thought at worst Johnny might run away again. The Johnsons had also noticed Johnny's troubled behavior, and they had called social services 3 times the day before the murder, asking that he be moved from their home. There was nothing really specific that they noticed, just that he was aggravated and edgy, and that he was breaking their rules, like they had a rule against cursing and swearing in the house. And Johnny would do that. And it wasn't like Johnny, because Johnny had generally been sort of sweet-natured with them. Now, Johnny's father had also been arrested recently on charges of abusing his children. And Johnny felt he always felt like he had to protect his parents, to take care of his parents. Of all the kids in his family, he was the one who sort of looked out for all the others, and he felt responsible for them. So a lot of things were going on inside of Johnny, but he didn't know. He didn't know the feelings inside of him. He couldn't identify them. For example, Johnny doesn't feel anger. He just gets angry at something. And oftentimes he'll smile when he's angry. He doesn't connect the emotions to how he's feeling. He's repeated several years of 5th grade. He's up to, I think, 8th grade now. He's been in maybe 6, 7 schools, mostly public. He was suspended 120 times from the last school he had been in for just talking when he shouldn't have been talking, from being disruptive, that sort of thing. And yet when he was in a group home that he liked very much, where JR was the counselor, he got almost straight A's. So, he was very influenced by his environment. It's in the afternoon now. Johnny had been fighting this feeling all day. And it's the afternoon, and he gets what he describes as an evil thought stuck in his head. He walks into the room where Mrs. Johnson is watching Oprah, and he has this thought, hit her over the head, just once, hit her over the head. He walks out. He's trying to, break this free of this feeling, but it's really churning inside of him. He waits longer, and then he says that he walks into the room where Mrs. Johnson is. And he, at this point, sees himself from outside of his body. It's as if he's in the corner of the room, the ceiling, looking down at the scene. And he said on one shoulder, on his right shoulder, he saw a little devil, like a cartoon figure, in a red cape, saying, "Hit her over the head, just do it, just once, hit her over the head, do it." And on the other shoulder, he saw a little angel in a white gown, like in the cartoons, saying, "No, Johnny, don't do it, don't do it." And they're arguing back and forth. So 3 times he walks into the kitchen where his foster mother is preparing dinner for him, his favorite dinner. And he sees an axe by the stove, by the wood stove, and he takes the axe in his hand. And twice he was able to turn and walk out. And the 3rd time, he hit her from behind and on the top of her head. She turned and looked at him. She didn't say anything, but he remembered the surprise in her eyes, and he remembered the surprise he felt. And he said to me later, "I never thought I had the guts to do something like that. I never thought I could do something like that." And then he struck her something like 12 to 15 times, according to the coroner, in her face and her eyes. Johnny said he hit her much more, many more times than that. He didn't realize how difficult it was to kill. I mean, how physically difficult. And he also said, and he wasn't proud of this, he had no idea how good it would feel to murder, how good that rage would feel. He's not proud of that. And he also said he knew something was wrong with him when he could watch her bleed to death and not feel anything. When he was arrested by detectives, they described his confession as the most bizarre confession they'd ever heard. It was even inhuman considering the brutal nature of the act. Right, he set her on fire. He poured kerosene on her. The idea was he kept hearing her breathe, he said. He thought he kept hearing her breathe. The coroner believes that she was dead before he set her on fire, but he was afraid she was breathing and that she would tell what happened. And he also had this idea that if he set her on fire, it would all just vanish. There would be nothing left of her or of anything. Mr. Johnson had gone out to get a space heater because the house was cold. It was a very, very cold winter. And he had gone out to get a space heater while his wife was talking to a friend in the house, and the friend had subsequently left. So he, in fact, when he was leaving, he had a sense that he shouldn't leave, and he had walked back towards the house. And then he heard his wife laughing, and he left again. So he was driving back to the house at this time when Johnny was, pacing back and forth after he'd set her on fire. He was still in a very agitated state. And then Johnny walked out into the night, and he walked down the same road that Mr. Johnson drove up, coming home. In fact, they passed each other, but Mr. Johnson didn't recognize Johnny. It was dark, and like most of these juvenile crimes, the crimes committed by juveniles, they happen between 3 and 6 in the afternoon. He knew immediately who had done it. He knew it was Johnny. There was no evidence linking Johnny to the case. In fact, the only reason he was arrested was that he was able to be brought to trial was because of his confession. And he confessed because he said he wanted help. But Mr. Johnson got on the phone. He called the police. He called the fire department actually first because of the smoke in the house. And Mr. Johnson, in his heart, believed that his wife was still alive, even though he knew she wasn't. It was a very poignant scene, I think, from the description of his neighbors and his friends there, and from Mr. Johnson himself. It was like he could no longer breathe. He knew his life had left. The description of the murder, that came from Johnny. It came to me. Some of it came out in the trial as well. He had also told his attorneys about the angel and the devil debating for him whether he should do this, and that it was an evil thought that told him to do this. And his attorney tried to get different psychiatrists to evaluate him to see whether he was fit to stand trial. And they had brought down in 3 different psychiatrists, and each of them determined that these cartoon figures were just an indication of an immature conscience, that they weren't indications that Johnnie was not fit to stand trial. I asked Johnnie, I said, well, why did you think of doing it this way, hitting her over the head? Because Johnnie had access to guns. There were different ways he could have done this. In fact, in my research, I found that there was one other time when he had thought of killing someone, and that had been a previous foster mother. And it was the same type of situation in which he wanted to stay, but he was going to be moved. And at that time, he had a gun buried in the backyard because she didn't permit guns in the house, and he respected her. But he had also thought of hitting her over the head. And I said, where did you ever get this idea of hitting someone over the head? He said, I don't know, maybe it was the cartoons or something. I said, well, did you expect that she would just die from getting hit over the head? And he said, yeah, I think I did. I think I would just have to hit her once, and that would be it, and I could put her in the closet, and there wouldn't be any blood or anything like that. So he was the one who thought that perhaps it came from cartoons. He didn't know where he got the idea, but it was something that stuck with him. It was pretty big. Just like every community that faces these kinds of seemingly inexplicable murders, these horrendous crimes, and that there was a lot of outrage, a lot of anger towards Johnnie. Put him away, and then let's move on. There was a lot of open wounds. Right after his case, they lowered the minimum age at which a child can be executed to 13. They changed the laws to make it easier to prosecute children as adults. It really came down to wanting to protect foster parents from these really evil kids. And, you know, that rather than looking at who Johnnie was and what happened to him and why this happened, the reaction was to change the laws so that we can put these kids away as soon as possible for as long as possible. That's hard for me to say, and it fluctuates. After Johnnie's arrest, the numbers went substantially down, and a lot of people complained when I wanted to write this book, you know, nobody's going to want a foster parent. And my argument was, no, the real foster parents out there know about these troubled kids, and they're begging social services to be honest. Even Mr. Johnson said that had he known of Johnnie's difficult behavior and rough past, he still would have taken Johnnie in. I found that remarkable after everything that had happened. He still would have taken Johnnie in, but he would have been prepared. He would have known what to look for. He would have known to make sure that Johnnie was getting some sort of counseling. So it's a... right. And our relationship changed substantially after I'd finished the book. During the book, I purposefully was cold to him. I purposefully kept up he had my number to call me collect. And I hadn't yet had my son during most of this time. And I felt that it was a professional relationship. In fact, there are often times I asked him tough questions and he gets so angry that I wondered if he'd ever call me back or if that was the end. But I had to ask those questions and I had to really put it to him. And then after the book came out, and he said something to me. He said, you know, I really don't want to be in here anymore. I really want to be out. But I realize I could do this again, and I don't want to do this again. I don't want to kill somebody again. It might happen, but I don't want that to happen. And we talked more and more, and I realized there was a type of self-awareness developing in Johnnie. Just having some connection to the outside world, because everybody had fallen away from him. The only person that he still kept in contact was with his former attorney. Mr. Johnson sought reform within the foster care, juvenile justice, and mental health care systems. He died before any of those reforms went anywhere, and with his death, the move towards reform was dropped, and that's why I felt it was important to continue, because Mr. Johnson wasn't educated beyond the 4th grade. And I think that that affected his ability to get the help that he needed to get these reforms. But he did have an attorney who was a former social worker who was going to fight for these reforms and trying to prove that the foster care system had been negligent in not telling, or criminal in not telling the Johnsons of Johnny's past. Now, it was really impossible to prove that they were anything but negligent in not telling the Johnsons, that it wasn't, it wasn't out of cruelty that they didn't tell them, it was just negligence. So there was an out-of-court settlement for just under $1 million, and the attorney received a cut of that. But Mr. Johnson died before he spent any of that money. He died of cancer, but it was really noticeable, the decline after Mrs. Johnson's death. He just withered. I watched him wither. He just had nothing left in him. His friends say he died of grief, and I personally believe that that's true. I think drugs and just a cycle of bad childhoods. Johnnie Jordan Sr., Johnnie Jordan Jr.'s father, had a difficult past too. He had actually also been in foster care at different times. His mother was a prostitute. His father was a pimp. He was illegitimate. Johnny's mother, Marilyn Monroe, at least that's what she said her name was. She told her husband her name was Marilyn Monroe. She had also had a difficult past that she wasn't willing to talk about, and it was assumed that there was a lot of abuse in her past as well. So I think that aside from the drug abuse, which is often a part of these difficult childhoods, that there are these cycles that are not being broken of abuse and neglect, of drugs, of bad parenting. Well, in Johnny's case, it was certainly both physical, but more damaging, I think, is the emotional abuse. The power people have over their kids, the brainwashing they do to say, this is normal. These people are out to get us. Don't go see a psychiatrist, They're just gonna try and get us. And if you open up at all to the outside, you're going to kill me, literally, because they'll put me in prison and people will kill me. It's an awful lot of responsibility for kids. That kind of abuse, I think, is more damaging and was more damaging to Johnny than anything you could put him through physically. Oftentimes with kids like Johnny, with Johnny, it was his parents were abusive and neglectful, and it took many, many times for social services to recognize that these kids had to be taken away. And by the time they were willing to terminate parental rights, it was really too late for most of these kids to be adopted. There was an insanity, and had Johnny known that that's what he was pleading, he would not have pled insanity, because he didn't want anybody to think he was crazy, no matter what. That was the most important thing to him, that nobody thought he was crazy. So, I found that at one time his probation officer, before the murder, about a month before the murder, his probation officer had noticed that Johnny was getting out of control and wanted to put him in a detention facility. To do so, he needed to appear before a judge with his social worker from foster care, the probation officer, and a mentor, and they all needed to be in agreement before the judge. The social worker had failed to show up at that meeting, so the move was thrown out, just like in traffic court if the police officer doesn't show up. And so Johnny was put back into the Johnsons' home. So I found that those three systems were not working together. In fact, in Ohio, like in many states, if a kid is found to be criminal or delinquent, they can no longer enter the mental health system. And I think most people would recognize that kids who are showing troubled behavior, whether it's abusing animals or assaulting each other, they need mental health as well as some sort of juvenile justice intervention. They need these programs to be working together, and they're not. They're all working separately. And that's why these kids aren't getting the help they need to develop emotionally, to develop the kind of conscience that we think that they don't have when they commit these crimes. This didn't have to happen. And because we can stop this from happening, Mrs. Johnson didn't have to die for these changes to be made. She did die. But as Mr. Johnson said, there are going to be a lot more Mrs. Johnsons out there until we do something about this. And if we can tell these stories and be honest about them, if we can really look at what's going on, we can prevent them. And these kids are our greatest hope. This is at the point at which we can change things. It's harder to change when people are in their later years or even middle years living in the tunnels under New York, and they have nothing to go back to above ground. But these kids, they have a future, and they know it. And all of the kids that I've talked to, they want to do right. They want to do good things. They want approval. They don't want to go out and murder somebody. But they're not getting what they need to develop into a healthy human being. And to me, that's what's so important. That's why these stories are important. I feel so much more enriched knowing someone like Johnnie Jordan even, and knowing Mr. Johnson. He taught me things that still today I think about every day. And I want to present things to people. I want readers to read what I have to write and come up with their own ideas, their own conclusions. A lot of people who have read my books have actually taught me things about things I've written. You know, they've seen other things than I've seen, and that's important to me.